Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that might just change the way you think about that cozy cup of tea you sip during your evening routine. Imagine for a moment you're in a bustling, foggy port in London, the air thick with the scent of freshly baked bread and, yes, tea. You're watching as sailors unload crates from distant lands, crates filled with the one thing that would come to define British culture, imperialism, and even global rivalries: tea. In the 17th century, it's a rare, exotic luxury. But what happens when something so simple, so humble, becomes a symbol of power, influence, and even revolution? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is over there. I'm always curious to know. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It starts in the 1600s, when tea wasn't just a drink, it was a symbol of class and luxury in Britain. It had already been enjoyed for centuries in China, where it was often used in rituals or just as a pleasant drink to start the day. But it wasn't until it was introduced to England in the early 1600s by Portuguese Princess Catherine of Braganza, who married King Charles II, that tea began to make its mark in British society. Picture this: you're one of the upper-crust folks in London, and the Queen is sipping tea. The next thing you know, it's everywhere. You'd see aristocrats at fashionable tea parties, finely dressed, their pinky fingers raised in a display of refinement, all while gossiping over the latest court scandals. At first, it's expensive, reserved for only the wealthiest, but slowly, tea's popularity grows, and it's no longer just a royal indulgence. By the late 1600s, people of all classes are sipping away, though, to be honest, you're probably still better off with a nice glass of wine if you're working class. Historians still debate whether the explosion of tea in Britain was fueled more by the nation's fascination with luxury or the growing desire to assert power over distant lands. Either way, by the early 1700s, tea had become an almost necessary part of British life, especially among the elite. It was so important that in 1706, an English merchant and inventor named Thomas Twining began to establish what we now know as the Twinings tea brand, setting the stage for the tea empire that would soon dominate the world. A quirky tidbit: during this period, there was also a bit of a tea-related scandal. Women, especially in upper society, would sometimes oversteep their tea to get a stronger, more intense flavor. But if they were caught, it wasn't just a bad brewing habit, it was a sign of poor taste, something that could destroy a reputation faster than being caught with the wrong shade of lipstick. It's funny how something as simple as tea could cause such a stir. By the 18th century, the demand for tea was so high that the British needed a reliable way to supply it. And that's when the East India Company, one of the most powerful monopolistic trading companies of its time, stepped in to handle the job. You're standing in a busy London street, the scent of fresh tea leaves mixing with the salty sea breeze. Overhead, the masts of trading ships sway in the wind as they dock at the port. But these aren't just any ships. They belong to the East India Company, the enormous, influential trading giant that's about to change the course of history. You've likely heard of the company. It's responsible for more than just a cup of tea. In fact, it's about to give birth to a whole new age of imperialism. Now, the East India Company wasn't just an ordinary business. It was a state-backed trading monopoly with the power to raise armies, negotiate treaties, and even wage war on behalf of Britain. It's hard to imagine in today's world, but back then, a company could be more powerful than entire countries. The company's initial goal was to trade spices and silks in the East, but as the demand for tea exploded in Britain, it quickly shifted focus. The East India Company established tea plantations in India, China, and later even in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. With direct access to these regions, the company had the monopoly on importing tea back to Britain. No other traders could compete, and before long, tea was flooding into the British market. This wasn't just about satisfying a thirst, it was about keeping the empire strong. The company's control over tea also led to one of the most fascinating aspects of the British Empire's tea trade: the sheer scale of the operation. By the late 1700s, the East India Company was importing over 1,000 tons of tea into Britain annually, and that's just the official trade. The black market was thriving too. It's estimated that illegal tea smugglers were bringing in just as much, if not more, than the company itself. These smugglers, known as tea pirates, were often very successful and became quite wealthy, sometimes making more than their legal counterparts. In fact, the smuggling industry became so profitable that the British government had to raise taxes on tea to curb it. It's an interesting irony. The more expensive the tea, the more people were willing to go to great lengths to get it. And here's a quirky little fact for you. If you've ever wondered where the term tea party comes from, it's not just about sipping tea in a posh garden, though we like to think of it that way. In the 18th century, tea was so revered that it wasn't unusual to throw a tea party where the tea itself was the main event. In fact, some of the wealthiest families in Britain would hold grand tea parties, in which the entire purpose was to flaunt their lavish collection of teas and expensive porcelain teapots. Historians still argue whether the East India Company's near-total monopoly on tea imports made Britain more economically stable or was a catalyst for future financial instability. What's clear is that it directly influenced Britain's expansion into Asia, cementing its status as an imperial giant. But the East India Company didn't just influence trade, it was about to get involved in something much more explosive: politics. The company's influence wasn't just about making money, it was about using that money to control entire regions. It was in this climate that the famous British conquest of India began to take shape, all driven by the need to secure access to tea, among other resources. The very act of importing tea became inextricably linked to Britain's imperial power, sparking a series of confrontations that would echo throughout history. And of course, we all know what comes next in this tangled web: the Boston Tea Party. But let's take a moment before we dive into that dramatic moment, as we're about to step into the heart of revolutionary tensions. You've probably heard of the Boston Tea Party, that moment when a group of rebellious colonists dressed up as Native Americans and dumped 324 chests of tea into the harbor. But let's take a closer look at why that cup of tea was so much more than just a colonial grudge. It wasn't simply a protest against high taxes. It was a dramatic showdown between the British Empire and its American colonies over control, power, and identity. Picture yourself on a cool December night in 1773, standing by the waterfront of Boston. The harbor is shrouded in mist, the sounds of the city muffled by the cold. As you watch the men in disguise board the British ships, you realize this is no ordinary act of defiance. This isn't just about tea, it's about the symbolic power tea had come to represent. The British government had decided to grant the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. They also imposed a hefty tax on tea, despite the fact that the colonists had no say in the matter, no representation in Parliament to argue against it. The idea was simple: the British would make money off the tea trade, and the colonies would be forced to pay for it. But to the American colonists, this was an infringement on their rights. And tea, already a drink of cultural significance, became the flashpoint for their anger. The Boston Tea Party wasn't just about a political tax. It was about the British Empire exerting control over their daily lives in the most subtle yet profound way. Tea was more than just a beverage. It was a social ritual, part of the fabric of colonial life. To have this seemingly harmless commodity taxed without consent felt like a violation of the colonists' autonomy. The dumping of the tea into the harbor wasn't just an attack on the British, it was an act of rebellion, a statement about the colonists wanted to build, and it was fueled by the most ordinary of items. Historians still argue whether the Boston Tea Party was truly the tipping point for the American Revolution. Was it the act of defiance that sparked the flames of revolution, or was it just one piece of a much larger puzzle? What we do know is that it became a symbol of the colonists' willingness to stand up against imperial control, and from that moment on, tea would forever be linked with ideas of freedom and independence. A quirky side note: the British were not amused. In fact, they were so enraged by the destruction of their precious tea that they passed the Coercive Acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts, which further tightened their grip on the colonies. These acts banned town meetings, closed the port of Boston, and led to even greater unrest. In a sense, the Boston Tea Party became a trigger for the revolutionary powder can, igniting a series of events that would eventually lead to independence. But while tea sparked one revolution, it also set the stage for an entirely different kind of battle, one that would be fought across oceans between Britain and its rivals on the global stage. The East India Company wasn't the only one trading tea, and soon the British would find themselves in a fierce competition for control of the tea market with their rivals, the French and the Dutch. The global tea war was about to begin, and it would take Britain's colonial ambitions to new heights.
As you settle in and sip your tea, let's pause for a moment and imagine a world where your everyday tea ritual isn't just about personal preference or leisure. No, in the 18th century, the mere act of enjoying a cup of tea was a silent statement of allegiance, a symbol of empire, and in some cases, a fuel for bitter competition. By the time the Boston Tea Party made waves across the Atlantic, the British were already embroiled in a full-scale battle with their European rivals over the global tea trade. The stage was set for the Global Tea War, a conflict that would stretch from the shores of India to the jungles of Southeast Asia and beyond. You can almost picture the scene in the offices of the East India Company as the board members planned strategies not only to defend their monopoly over tea, but also to outsmart their rivals. The Dutch and the French had long established trade routes to China and Southeast Asia, and they were no less keen to control the tea markets. As British merchants took their ships into the East, competing tea exports from these countries posed a serious challenge. One of the most interesting chapters of this tea warfare was the intense rivalry between Britain and the French over the East Indies, specifically modern-day Indonesia. The French were keen on establishing their own tea plantations in this region, and for a time they succeeded. But here's where the British, through sheer force of will and, of course, imperial greed, began to turn the tide. They leveraged their control over India to push their tea trade further, establishing vast plantations in Assam, which still today produces some of the world's most famous teas. This colonial conflict wasn't just about tea, though. It was also about the geopolitical control of vast areas of land and influence. The East India Company wasn't merely selling tea. It was laying the groundwork for British control over nearly all of Southeast Asia, including the creation of their prized Indian Raj. Tea became a tool, a way of spreading British influence far beyond the London tea tables. Think about it. Every time a British consumer sipped their tea, it was a silent tribute to the empire's far-reaching hand. In every teapot was a symbol of empire, rivalry, and competition. And of course, money. Lots and lots of money. While the British Empire was pushing its tea agenda, the French were not about to sit idly by. The French East India Company worked tirelessly to establish their own foothold in the tea trade, especially in places like Pondicherry, in modern-day India, and later even in parts of China. But while the French and Dutch made their moves, they were largely playing catch-up. The British had already established a strong network of tea plantations and trading routes by the time these rivals fully entered the fray. A quirky little tidbit: you may have noticed that tea in Europe and the United States is often referred to as black tea, but in China, it's known as red tea. The reason for this lies in cultural differences. While Europeans and the British were obsessed with the strong, dark brew of black tea, the Chinese preferred a lighter, more delicate approach. This small distinction in terminology hints at the vast cultural and political landscapes tea traversed. It was both a commodity and a cultural touchstone, and each empire and country viewed it differently, reflecting the political and cultural nuances of their own colonial ambitions. Historians still debate whether the global tea trade ultimately enriched or harmed the British Empire. While it undoubtedly brought enormous wealth and power, it also contributed to the massive social and political changes that would eventually lead to the collapse of the empire. The push to control the global tea market through monopolistic practices like those of the East India Company led to widespread unrest, labor exploitation, and the eventual demand for more democratic government. But for now, we can sit back and sip our tea, appreciating how something so ordinary became so globally significant. As tea's journey continued to weave itself into the fabric of empire, the stakes were rising. The game wasn't just about controlling the tea leaves, it was about controlling the future of entire regions and peoples. And while the British had the advantage in the tea trade, it was clear that other empires wouldn't go down without a fight. And so, the tea war raged on, with consequences that would echo into the modern world. As you settle into the last cup of your tea, perhaps a little colder now, it's time to think about the legacy this humble beverage has left on the world. You followed tea's journey from a rare luxury to the symbol of empire, from a catalyst for revolution to the battleground of imperial rivalry. But what about today? How has tea's long and tumultuous history shaped modern culture? And how does it continue to influence our lives in ways we might not even realize? To begin with, let's return to Britain. Tea is still, as they say, the national drink, though it's no longer a symbol of colonial power. Nowadays, it's the beverage of comfort, relaxation, and even community. Imagine yourself in a quaint British home. There's always time for tea, isn't there? It's more than just a drink. It's an institution, ingrained into the very rhythms of daily life. Afternoon tea, once reserved for royalty, has become part of British culture where it's as much about the social experience as it is about the tea itself. And if you've ever had a proper British cuppa, you know it's not just about the tea leaves. It's about the ritual, the teapot, the cups, the milk, and maybe a scone or two. Of course, tea also remains incredibly important to global cultures, particularly in places like India and China. In India, chai tea, spiced with cardamom, cinnamon, and ginger, has become inseparable from everyday life. The Indian tea industry is one of the largest in the world, and the practice of drinking tea is deeply embedded in the country's culture, whether you're in the bustling streets of Mumbai or a quiet rural village. In China, tea remains sacred, used in religious rituals as well as enjoyed during family gatherings. The ceremonial tea-drinking traditions are still a vital part of life in China, Japan, and other parts of East Asia, with every sip carrying centuries of cultural significance. Now let's think about the modern global tea industry. In some ways, tea has come full circle. While the great colonial powers of the 18th and 19th centuries no longer dominate the global trade in the same way, the tea industry is still largely controlled by multinational corporations. The major tea producers are countries like India, China, Kenya, and Sri Lanka. But the legacy of empire lingers. The tea plantations that were established under colonial rule are still major sources of income for many of these nations. But the exploitation that once characterized these industries has been replaced or at least complicated by issues of fair trade and sustainability. Speaking of sustainability, there's also been a recent movement towards organic, environmentally friendly tea production, which is a far cry from the massive industrial-scale plantations that were the hallmark of colonial-era tea trade. Consumers today are increasingly aware of the environmental and ethical issues that come with tea production. Issues like pesticide use, labor exploitation, and land ownership disputes in places like Darjeeling or Assam. So the global tea industry continues to evolve, but it's still shaped by the forces of empire that began centuries ago. A quirky note, ever wondered why tea bags exist? Tea bags were actually invented by accident. Back in the early 1900s, a New York merchant named Thomas Sullivan sent out samples of his loose-leaf tea in small silk bags. Customers thought they were meant to be steeped directly in the water, and voila, the tea bag was born. It's funny to think that something so common today began as a happy accident, though it's hardly as quaint as the loose-leaf variety from centuries past. Historians still argue whether the global consumption of tea is ultimately a positive or negative legacy of empire. Is tea still just an innocent pleasure, or is it a constant reminder of a colonial past, one that left lasting scars on the countries where it was grown? There's no easy answer, but one thing is clear. Tea's journey, from its humble beginnings in China to its rise as the fuel of empire, is a fascinating testament to the strange ways that global trade and cultural exchange can shape the world. So as you take the last sip from your cup, imagine the long journey that this beverage has taken and how it continues to shape the way we interact with one another and the world around us. And maybe, just maybe, you'll never look at your next cup of tea in the same way again.